We're now beginning our fourth and last sections for Chapter 1. We're going to be looking at the Dunning-Kruger effect and examining three big theories. I do want to mention the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is when we don't recognize self-incompetence. There are things we know, there are things we don't know. There are things we know we don't know, and this is where Dunning-Kruger lives. There are things we don't know we don't know. We begin with the example of Arthur Wheeler, who in 1995 attempted to rob a bank while his face was covered with lemon juice. He had learned that lemon juice can be used as invisible ink, and he got the idea that lemon juice would render his facial features invisible. It didn't. We see this effect in people who proclaim they have competence when they've had no training or experience in the skill. When the Dunning-Kruger effect is in operation, we will encounter those individuals who, not recognizing their own lack of skills, fail to accurately gauge the skills of others. They not only fail to see their own incompetency, but they don't recognize competency when they do encounter it. This is frustrating at best and dangerous at worst when the effect is in operation with someone who has major decision-making powers. There is the corollary that those people who are competent may not recognize this. They assume that others also find the activity easy and understandable. Now, our last topic for this chapter is to briefly touch on three major theories. We begin with the psychoanalytic theories. We'll be talking more about them in the chapter on personality. We associate these theories most closely with Sigmund Freud. These theories suggest that behavior is driven by unconscious and subconscious feelings, fears, and desires. One of the more interesting and disturbing issues relates to the origins of this theory. Freud was interested in treating hysteria. This was the most widespread complaint for women of the day. Men cannot experience hysteria as they do not have a uterus. The disorder was considered untreatable and could have a woman placed in an asylum. By the way, we don't recognize this as a disorder nowadays. Freud promoted a new therapy called talking therapy. Today, when we read through the case files, there are a number of his patients who were reporting symptoms suggestive of sexual abuse, but each time these reports were dismissed as fabrications or fantasies. One of your handouts here. Freud was a stage theorist, obviously. You had to pass successfully through each of these stages to become a functional adult. Now, we also get any number of interesting terms from Freud, things like denial, projection, rationalization. Now, there are a number of positive things that we get from Freud. The idea that early experiences can be profoundly impactful, that family relationships are important, not to mention the entire concept of the unconscious. However, on the negative side, it's difficult to test. Freud's theories are not good science. We also know that he related everything to sex. It's very negative. It's amazing that any one of us is able to walk around and function even marginally. It's also very gender biased. Any problems you have, they're probably because your mother did something wrong. Now, a second group of theorists are the cognitive theorists. We'll be spending much more time on this theory later in the course. Jean Piaget stands out in this group, and easily the most important thing we get. The most important thing we get from him is the idea that children are not only different from adults because they know less, quantitative differences, but they think differently from adults, qualitative differences. Some positive things we gain from the cognitive theorists is that thinking is an active process, and it changes from age to age. Some criticisms of Piaget's original theories. They tends to be somewhat rigid, and he doesn't allow for individual variations. The information processing model, which came after Piaget, folks, it's a hot mess. We'll be reviewing this theory in considerable depth later in this course. The last group of theorists are the behaviorists, and again, we'll revisit this group in the personality chapter. We've already mentioned Alfred Bandura with the Bobo doll experiment. John B. was the first of these theorists, a contemporary of Freud. He felt that behavior was maintained by conditioning and was responsible for one of the most important pieces of research ever done in psychology. This was the Little Albert experiment. Watson had been impressed by the work of Ivan Pavlov. You may remember he discovered classical conditioning when he found that he could make dogs salivate when a bell was presented if he paired the bell with food presentation several times. Watson replicated this with a human child, little Albert, a 9-month-old child. He first introduced white fluffy things which had a typical response, patting and rubbing. He then paired the white fluffy things with an abrupt presentation of a man in a scary mask, which elicited a fear response. He then presented little Albert with white fluffy things and, ta-da, there was a fear response. Now, do you have any problems with this experiment? Well, yeah. It was probably responsible for the APA coming up with ethical guidelines for research on humans. Now, Watson had every intention of deconditioning respondent extinction when little Albert's father got a better job and moved away. The question of what happened to little Albert was a serious one that haunted many psychologists. In 2012, some researchers announced that little Albert was a neurologically impaired individual who died soon after the experiment. However, in 2014, other researchers identified a better candidate, a man who, according to living relatives, had been an easygoing man who'd lived a long, satisfying life. In another handout related to Watson, you may notice that he was born and raised in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. One of the homes in which he lived is still in existence. I've been there. It's a private residence, so you can only stand outside on the road and gaze at it. Contributions from Watson and other behaviorists include a reliance on data and observations. Criticisms include a lack of focus on cognition and no attention to developmental changes. This is the end of our first